where the ancient stones of the Tower of London reflected the first rays of the sun. An American, Roger Smith, who did not care what he was looking at, began to curse the English heritage. His voice echoed throughout the courtyard filled with tourists. "These are just old stones," he said, glancing impudently at the huge walls. "We would have demolished all this long ago and built something useful." His wife turned away, trying to avoid the stares of others. But Smith did not stop. "It's a museum, not a real power." He raised his voice again, walking toward the royal guard standing at the gate. His words became more aggressive. "In America, we create history, not preserve it. There are only stones and old traditions here." The tourists turned around, involuntarily listening, but no one dared to intervene while the guard stood there, unmoving. Then Smith, as if tearing out his last thought, turned to him. "Is this what your army does? Stand around and waste time?" But this guard, quiet and steadfast, decided to answer. And it was not what he expected. The stones of the Tower of London, consumed by wind and time, stood as they had for centuries, majestic and unbreakable. In the morning light, its walls, covered with centuries-old secrets, looked as if they were alive, ready to tell a story to anyone who was willing to listen. Tourists strolled through the courtyard, admiring the grandeur of this historic site. But for one man, it was just part of another tourist route. Roger Smith, a middle-aged American with a heavy businessman's face and a confident stride, walked among the tourists with a smile on his face, even though his comments were getting louder, attracting the attention of people around him. His wife, Jennifer, walked beside him, with an unpleasant expression on her face, trying to hide her irritation. Their 16-year-old son, Ben, walked along silently, feeling drawn to the new experience, but not wanting to get involved in the conversation. "Look at this," Roger said, raising his voice so that everyone around him could hear. "It's all just rocks. We would have torn all this down long ago and built something useful. We're building rockets, and here we have these old walls." He glanced up at the towers of the tower, which rose to the sky, as if oblivious to their age and importance. Jennifer pursed her lips, looking away. She was sure this dirty view of history would only make their trip worse. Ben, who had often heard similar remarks from his father, simply nodded and turned his gaze to the guard standing nearby at the gate. "It's not just rocks, Roger," Ben said quietly, his voice barely audible. "You don't even know how much history there is here." But his father didn't even pay attention. It seemed to him that all these old traditions were just an outdated duty that no longer meant anything, something that the modern nation had to get rid of. "Listen, this is all just for tourists. In America, we are creating the future, and here they sit and waste time on these old ceremonies. It's all for museums," Roger continued, glancing once again at the tall guard standing next to him. The royal bodyguard stood, as always, completely still. His gray face showed no emotion, and his uniform, even from a distance, looked impeccable, with bronze buttons reflecting the sunlight. Roger approached him, smiling. "That's why your army is worthless. They just put on these suits and stand around while the rest of the world develops," he said with a sneer, pointing his finger at the guard. Not a single movement, not a single gesture, only eyes staring straight ahead, like a statue. But some of the tourists had already begun to pick up on this. "But why don't you say something?" asked a woman standing next to him. She was from America, from the same state as Roger. She nodded at him, supporting his words, as if she agreed with his thoughts. "We don't just stand around in the army." Roger smiled with satisfaction, referring to his own belief that military duty was about real power. But he failed to notice that a few British tourists standing nearby began to take umbrage. The older men, with medals on their chests, remained silent, but their looks clearly expressed what they thought of his words. Smith moved on, not paying attention to those around him. He raised his voice, trying to convince his family, as well as the rest of the audience, that the whole story was a relic of the past. While he was arguing, he did not notice how the guard shifted his posture slightly and the air around him became heavier. "Well, we have more and more military bases. We are working on the future. And here? This is the whole army, ceremonial soldiers. War is no longer about standing at a post. It's about modern technology," he said, glancing at the guard. The guard didn't change his position, but some kind of current passed between him and Roger, as if to check whether he was going beyond the limits of what was allowed. Although everything seemed calm, the atmosphere changed. It was noticeable. Time seemed to stand still. Tourists began to come closer, forming a crowd around Roger, who continued his shameless speech. His voice grew louder and louder, as if he represented all of modern America, which was rejecting the past. His wife, Jennifer, turned away even more, trying to avoid the eyes of those who noticed her husband. Ben stood next to her, his eyes closed in disgust and boredom. He tried again to explain, but it didn't work. What you don't understand, Ben, is that your country stopped a long time ago. I'm here to show you that real strength is what we build in America, Roger proclaimed, as if his words were the ultimate truth that could not be denied. But what happened next came as a surprise to him. The guard, who had been standing silently by his side, suddenly stepped forward. At first it was barely noticeable, just a shift in weight. But with every movement, with every breath of air, it became obvious. The guard was no longer just a monument that everyone around him was used to. His heavy, emotionless posture changed. He didn't move, but he seemed like a different person. Roger, not noticing this at first, continued his lecture. He was so engrossed in his own rhetoric that he didn't even realize how everything around him began to change. But suddenly he heard a voice, low, calm, but filled with harsh power. Perhaps you should think about it a bit, sir. It was not what he had expected. His smile faded, and he turned to the guard, even laughing a little, thinking that he had decided to politely pay attention to his words. But the guard didn't look like his usual self. He looked at him with such dignity and calmness that Roger felt uncomfortable. "Excuse me?" asked Roger, as if it were a normal tourist situation that could be ignored. The guard shifted a little, and his voice became more tangible, like every composed step, like every lift. "You talk about the army is outdated, but you don't even know what's behind the uniform," he said, loudly, so that everyone in the crowd could hear. The slight pressure of his words made the air around him shudder. Now he was no longer just a guard standing guard. He had become someone who had the right to speak. And although his voice remained calm, something in it seemed so strong that even Roger could not dismiss it. The tourists around him became quiet, and this moment became not only a personal struggle between two people, but also something more, a struggle for understanding and dignity. "You forgot one thing," the guard continued, his eyes never leaving Roger's. "We don't just preserve old traditions. We honor them because they matter. Do you think military power is all about technology? No, sir. It's also in the people who stand here to defend what matters to them." Roger tried to respond, but his voice trailed off as the crowd grew. He was not prepared for this moment. This wasn't just a story. This was the truth mixed with something he couldn't understand. "And it's not just costumes," the guard added. "It's an honor." These words pierced the silence. Some tourists in the crowd had already begun to look at the guard with respect. Ben heard his father try to respond, but it was not enough. The guard continued to speak. "If you want, I will tell you what is really behind this army." The tourists quietly looked at each other, feeling the change in the atmosphere. Although Roger still intended to speak, it was now clear to him that he was not dealing with some indifferent soldier, but with a professional who understood the power behind his silence. It was a moment when all his rhetoric seemed like just empty noise. Everyone standing around felt the atmosphere change, like time stood still for a moment. The gazes of the tourists became more attentive. Some even started to take steps back, feeling that this moment had turned into something more than just a quarrel between a tourist and a security guard. Roger was silent for a moment, his confidence beginning to melt away like the wind blowing dust in the hot sun. He knew he couldn't let this go unanswered, but his words grew smaller and his face lost its usual confidence. He was used to having everything around him bend to his views. But this guard was not bending. He was not a part of a museum exhibition. He was a living part of history, a part of a country that not only preserved its past but continued to write new chapters. And it became obvious to everyone around him. Roger realized that any attempt to continue his lecture would be just empty words. He opened his mouth, but realized that he had no answers or arguments. Could he have realized that behind this silence were decades of combat experience that would never be covered in tourist brochures? "Maybe you want to know more?" the guard asked, his voice less rigid, but no less heavy. "About why we are still standing at the post, why our soldiers wear these uniforms?" The tourists began to quietly exchange glances. It was no longer just curiosity about British history, it was a real need to understand. Roger couldn't help but notice how his rhetoric began to melt like snow in the first sunlight. "You talk about tradition, about heritage," the guard continued. "But there is one more thing you may not realize. The things we keep are not just museum pieces. They are symbols of what we have been through, and what we are still willing to go through to protect our country. Roger felt his body tense. It seemed that his image of an American who comes in and changes everything was crumbling before this restrained confidence that the guard radiated. Quietly, but undeniably, he was showing him that real power is not always measured by technology or new achievements. Sometimes strength is what remains when things change. It is the steadfastness that you can rely on. But all this was only part of the picture. The guard, as if removing all ceremonial importance, became closer to his words. It was no longer just a lecture, but a direct challenge. What do you know about how we stood in the shadows while the world was changing? About how we survived when everything seemed to be falling apart? About how we learned to live, protecting what could not be forgotten? His voice sounded dull but clear, like metal that does not rust. And suddenly Roger felt his own beliefs begin to crumble. He kept trying to bring his disorder together with his inner feeling again, but it wasn't working anymore. He could no longer stand by what he had so proudly proclaimed before. Word by word, his efforts to continue were turning into empty sound. And then he saw one of the veterans standing next to him suddenly raise his head. It was an elderly man with medals on his chest. He walked closer to the guard, and his gaze was just as unwavering. "These medals are not just souvenirs," he said, turning his gaze to Roger. "They are what we won in battle. And what we lost for the sake of these medals also matters." These words were not just a response to Roger, they were his opportunity to realize what he did not know. What had always been before his eyes now became clear. The war, the struggle, even these old forms, were not just cultural relics. It was a story of how a people, respecting their past, continued to move forward. And although Roger still intended to speak, the guard simply turned away, leaving behind words that echoed in the hearts of everyone who witnessed this conversation. The crowd around him still stood, quietly listening as the voices dissipated across the courtyard, leaving only tension and a new silence. Roger stood there, nervously whispering under his breath, trying to find new words to answer the call, but they didn't come. His thoughts were a mess, and he no longer had the strength to resist the reality he was presented with. It seemed that his confidence had completely disappeared. And although he kept trying, his gaze was distracted by the guard, whose eyes remained as unmoving as ever. He no longer had the mocking lack of respect that had previously filled his every word. The guard was unwavering, but there was something in his silence that spoke more than the words that could have been drawn out of him. The tourists who had been watching the conversation with interest a few minutes earlier gradually began to move away. Their gazes were different now, not with contempt or irony, but with a certain understanding that an important event was taking place here in the heart of London. They were witnessing not just a dispute between two people, but a clash between two worlds that had long coexisted despite their obvious differences. Roger looked at his family. Jennifer looked as if she had just experienced a severe emotional shock, and Ben stood quietly, with a look that seemed deeper than usual. They still couldn't return to normal conversation, and everything that was said seemed to hang between them. "Do you hear that?" Jennifer suddenly whispered, turning to her husband. He nodded but did not answer. It was not the usual silence. It was the kind of silence that cannot be filled with mere words. He felt that his views on the army, on tradition, and even on Great Britain itself had changed, but he was not ready to admit it. Perhaps not yet. Instead, his gaze fell on the guard again, and this time he did not look for reasons to laugh or scorn in his face. This man stood before him as the living embodiment of everything Roger had ignored and rejected. They stood at opposite poles, and both had their own truths. But the guard's truth now sounded much more convincing. Roger glanced at the medals on the veteran's chest, and it reminded him of one thing he didn't like. These medals had meaning to them, and it wasn't something that could just be dismissed as a relic of the past. "You made a good point," Roger finally said, pausing for a moment, feeling a little surprised that those words had come out of his mouth. He tried to keep his pride in place, but he couldn't find the strength to deny what he had just learned. There was a new tone in his voice. The guard didn't answer right away. He just tilted his head in a sign of respect not to Roger, but to those who realized what had happened. He returned to his posture and became completely still again. His posture returned to a stern restraint that Roger could not have imagined a few minutes ago without some irony. Tourists were returning to their routes, and only a few people were still standing, watching Roger and his family. The feeling of shame that suddenly gripped Roger was so heavy that he had trouble breathing. "Let's go," he said, trying to look calm, even though he realized that this day was not going to go as he had planned. Ben and Jennifer followed him in silence. They didn't ask what was wrong, didn't ask questions that might cause Roger to break the peace again. They simply walked alongside him, leaving behind them the courtyard of the tower and all its walls, which had witnessed not only centuries of history but also a new, unexpected conversation. The silence that remained after their departure was not only the silence that usually envelopes old places, but also the silence of a new realization.